Are you struggling to see progress in your Spanish, no matter how much time or effort you put in? It might not be your grammar or vocabulary, or even your accent that's holding you back. Instead, there's one mistake that almost every single language learner makes, and it could honestly be the very thing that is standing between you and fluent Spanish. But the good news is that once you stop doing this, you'll notice a dramatic improvement in your Spanish. If you don't know me, my name is Hamid. I'm 15 years old, and I became a polyglot at 13 years old after getting fluent in Spanish, which became my fourth language. And I achieved this in about 5 days of studying straight, so 120 hours. And those hours of studying were dispersed across a period of a few months, mainly during the summer of 2022. And this is how I sounded before that summer.
Hola, estoy comiendo comida. Voy a mejorar mi español.
Y en este video voy a hablar de un hábito que si dejas de hacerlo, tu español va a mejorar mucho. Before the summer of 2022, this guy in my class had made it like a trend to study Spanish in his free time, and he started seeing an improvement in his classes. And this guy wasn't a particularly smart student, and that sort of started a trend in our class to study like using language apps in his free time because he used Duolingo. And so I did a ton of research on different apps, and I eventually found an app called Language Transfer. And I took this app, I saw a big improvement directly. I saw like literally my Spanish went from like nothing to actually I was able to start making sentences. And so this is great. I recommended Language Transfer to my friend, and my friend tried it, and he literally wanted to gatekeep it because that's how good it was. Now, I went through the entire Language Transfer course, and I went through it again during the summer 2022. And that was essentially the entire grammar part of learning Spanish was sorted. But what was really great about Language Transfer is that he gave a thinking method of how one should think in Spanish. And this is what I really used, and this like concept of thinking in Spanish, of how to think through Spanish, I applied it during the summer when I was doing 2 exercises. I found 2 YouTubers who got fluent. One were called Language Lords. He got fluent in 44 days. And the concepts from both was that they just both did a ton of speaking and listening in terms of speaking Spanish and listening to Spanish. And so I had 2 exercises, a speaking exercise and a listening exercise. And for both of them, I would use this like thought process of how Language Transfer taught me, and it really helped me understand everything way better. Because what I noticed was that most beginners translate directly in their head. They translate what they want to say in English to Spanish. But this confuses the learner because they don't know why there are certain discrepancies in the translation. For example, in Spanish, to make sense is to have feeling. So it has feeling is it makes sense. And so the main framework here, the main thought process here that Language Transfer explained is that instead of thinking in English and then translating to Spanish, when it comes to making a sentence, like when we want to create a sentence, we don't want to think in English and then translate to Spanish. Instead, you want to think in Spanglish, in this like Spanish grammar, where the structure and the grammar is in Spanish, but the actual words are in English, and then from there translate it to Spanish. And that is simply to think that what is the Spanish way of saying it, right? So instead of saying it makes sense, instead of thinking, oh, it makes sense, right? You haven't understood anything there, which means now that is useless. You've just memorized it. Okay, this is again the problem with memorizing grammar, literally just memorizing something without understanding it really. But when you understand that to make sense is to have feeling, now you can say she has feeling, now you can say they make sense, he makes sense, we make sense, it doesn't make sense, etc. You can say all the different forms of making sense in every single different tense. So let me give you some examples of what I mean, okay? If I'm trying to translate I might come over, in Spanish you would say it can, in the sense that it can be that I come over. And then we translate that to Spanish is it can, and then it's like it can be, right? It can, and it's like a parenthesis, it can be, but you just say it can. And then I come over, or I come. So if you had directly thought I might, you'd probably think, oh, how do you say might in Spanish? But there is no might in Spanish. There is no I might, you might, he might. There is no such verb. There is another structure for saying that in Spanish, which is why you have to think about it in the Spanglish way. For example, if you want to say I couldn't miss it, you would have to say I couldn't lose myself it. That would mean like I couldn't miss it, in the sense that like I couldn't miss the show, right? Or even quotes. Like there's a lot of quotes in English that we use, and in Spanish it's a little different. So if you want to say like it is what it is, right? Or like you can't do anything about it. It is what it is. In Spanish, you say it is what there is, or it is what there are. Or for example, like to stay in Spanish is to remain oneself. So if I had to say, I want to stay, you'd have to say, I want to remain myself. So the structure here is you have what you want to say, right? In English, I want to stay. Then you want to understand how you say it in the Spanglish way. Essentially, in the structure of Spanish, it would be, I want to remain myself. Then you translate to Spanish directly. So you say, I want to remain myself, or myself I want to remain, right? And the reason for this is because the easiest way to make mistakes is to translate directly. If it's a one-step process where you directly translate from English to Spanish, you're going to see discrepancies that don't make sense. But when you have this extra Spanish structured, where it's structured in Spanish, but said in English, you'll start getting a feel of Spanish, okay? Even though it has nothing to do with vocabulary, it has to do with grammar. And this is what we're talking about, grammar, okay? With the way Spanish grammar works, this is to understand how Spanish grammar works. This is like the thinking method. You want to first translate literally of how you say it in Spanish, and this works backwards as well. For example, to lose oneself is to miss something, like miss out on something. When I first realized that, then I started experimenting with it. How would I say you couldn't miss it? Or how would I say I missed it? Do you know what I mean? Like I would use different structures to understand that. And I would do this structure backwards. So I realized that, okay, perdérmelo, to lose myself to missing out. And the opposite would work the same, to miss out on something or to like not be there for something. And then you get to lose oneself and then translate to Spanish, or oneself is se, that's why. If it's for me, it's me, etc. And this acquaints for the reason why directly translating doesn't work. Because direct translation doesn't account for word placement or sentence structure. Or like, you know, there are tons of native sayings like, I don't care at all is, I care a little cucumber. Like that's a quote from Spain. So to think of this method of first translating to the Spanish structure and the Spanish grammar, and then translating the Spanish words is extremely important. In fact, my framework for grammar, I call the 3 W's. It is what, where, and why. So what are the words? Where are they placed? And then you want to always answer, why are they placed like that? Why does that happen? Because when you explain why something happens, then it's just easier to understand. So the what is just the words. So that's just the vocabulary. You don't need vocabulary. Like, you don't need to get vocabulary first. First is just understand the structure, the grammar, the where. So just understand, firstly, how do you say to stay? To stay is to remain oneself. Great. Then we need to know where that structure goes. And to really understand this, we want to first think in English, then English but with Spanish structure. So English with Spanish grammar but not Spanish vocab. And then we add the Spanish vocab. Because a Spanish sentence is literally just vocab and grammar. Grammar is just the conjugation and where the words are placed. And so that's literally it's the what and the where. And so this method of thinking exercises that. You always want to not memorize, but you want to think through the process. How would you say this in Spanish? First, you want to think about how you'd say it in English with Spanish grammar, and then it is just a direct translation. And using this method, you are creating like a different thinking method. You're creating like a different logic, okay? Like if I would only speak Spanish right now, I'm gonna try making like 2-3 sentences where I'm only going to use Spanish grammar while I'm speaking English, okay? Now same, I am speaking Spanish. No, I want to speak more because to me it seems difficult to speak of this way. Okay, I tried my best there. Obviously, I'm used to speaking Spanish and just directly translating it to Spanish. When I think through how to say something from English to Spanish, I want to go through this method of thinking. You always want to have this middle step where you're thinking with English vocab but with Spanish grammar. Because once you get grammar down, it's literally just knowing the words. And knowing the words is as simple as just memorizing them, essentially. Repetition. If you want to learn Spanish the way I learn Spanish and achieve similar results, then check the description for one-on-one coaching. And I hope this video and stay humble.